Welcome to the 15th episode of the ongoing series, The 10 Lost Tribes in Jewish Consciousness, here on Sfarim Chatter. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the series moves the series into more modern times, discussing Ethiopian Jews, the Lemba tribe, other black Jews of Africa, and so on. The corporate sponsor of this series is, as always, Gluck Plumbing. For all your service needs, big or small, in New Jersey, with a full service division from boiler replacements, main sewer line snakeouts, cameraing main lines, to a simple faucet leak, Gluck Plumbing Service Division has you covered. Give them a call, 732-523-1836, extension 1. Again, 732-523-1836, extension 1. And if you call them, please tell them you heard them on the podcast and thank them for their support of the podcast. To sponsor an individual episode of this series, please email me sfarimchatter@gmail.com, and you can also do so if you would like to sponsor an episode on the podcast in general or to support the podcast in any way. Again, you can email me sfarimchatter@gmail.com or see the links and information in the show's notes below. You can also subscribe to the Sfarim Chatter WhatsApp community where I post new Sfarim, books, book deals, and so on. There's a link in the show's notes, as well as Sfarim Chatter Substack and YouTube. Additionally, you can please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen, whether that's on 24/6, Apple, Spotify, and so on. And also check out the link in the show's notes for a number of Professor Parfit's books, really fascinating and interesting books. So with that, enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast and another episode in the ongoing series here in Sfarim Chatter, the 10 Lost Tribes in Jewish Consciousness. In this episode of the series and of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Tudor Parfit, who is Distinguished University Professor at Florida International University in the Department of Religious Studies, and he is also the President Isaac Navon Chair in Sephardic and Mizrahi Studies. So thank you, Professor Parfit, for joining me.
I'm very happy to be with you.
So let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, I was born and brought up in the United Kingdom, as you can probably tell from my accent. I'm actually Welsh, and I come from a very sort of philo-Semitic family. They were non-conformists, and they always had a very, very tender spot for Jewish people. Indeed, when I was a little kid, a Jewish refugee was taken into the house in Wales and stayed there for some time. And that's one of my earliest memories towards the end of the Second World War. And, I had a very sort of regular English upbringing, but it just so happened that when I was 19, I applied to do voluntary service overseas, which is like the British equivalent of Peace Corps. And as luck would have it, they sent me to Israel, and I worked in Jerusalem for a year at a place called Kvar Shvedi, which means the Swedish village. And I was working with handicapped kids, and some of the older children in the institution were Holocaust survivors. And once a week, the social worker in this institution in Jerusalem, whose name was Lola Zinga, would take me around the country to visit the parents of the children. And this, for me, was an eye-opener, because I got to meet Jews from Kurdistan and from Iran and from the Yemen and from Poland and from Romania and from just about every country on the face of the earth. And I was very excited by the whole idea of this dispersion. And over the year that I was there, I became very enthusiastic about Israel. I was a great Zionist and all that. And shortly after starting at university, I was at Oxford. I decided to change from history, which was my first chosen subject. I did that for a year. And then I changed to Hebrew and Arabic. And that really was the beginning of my career in Jewish studies.
Now, as you mentioned, you got interested in Jewish studies and Jewish history, but how did you become interested in the lost tribes? As you know, I didn't mention your books, and you have countless books. I should mention them at some point. I'm sure they'll come up, and I'll mention them here in a minute. But you've done a lot of work on, and that's what we'll be talking about here. And you've done a lot of your own work on the ground. Besides for research, you've written on the Jews of Ethiopia, the Beta Israel, and you've done work on a number of others. And I have here that I'll just read this already. Now you have in your book Journey to the Vanished City, where you go throughout South Africa and Zimbabwe and other parts of the continent in Africa. You look for the Lemba tribe, which we'll talk about, and just the first blurb on the back from the Wall Street Journal is Parfit is a British Indiana Jones seeking the lost tribes of Israel. So how did you become interested in them, that you've done a lot of your work, a lot of your research has been about that topic?
Yeah, well, I did my DPhil on a subject to do with the Jews in the land of Israel in the 19th century. And that was my first introduction to very kind of exotic Jewish communities, I suppose, because there was an institution at the time which was called the Chalukah. And the Chalukah was a system which brought donations from the pious Jewish community of the land of Israel from wherever the shlichim, the emissaries, went to collect it. And so, I was looking at these records of the shlichim in places like India and all over the place. And so I became aware of the myth of the lost tribes. But the real turning point in my career came in 1984. So in 1984, one day, I'm asked by a certain David Kessler to go and join him at the Athenaeum Club in London's West End for lunch. And over a very excellent lunch and a bottle of wine, David Kessler, who was a pillar of the Jewish community and the chairman of the Jewish Chronicle, the great Jewish weekly in the United Kingdom. And he said, Parfit, I'm not sure that we're doing enough for he used the word falasha. We don't use that word anymore, but that's the word he used. And I said, probably not. No, I wasn't very knowledgeable about this community, but a few days later, he telephoned me and said, we've decided that you should go to the Sudan because the Ethiopian Jews are being poisoned in the refugee camps by Christians. And you're the ideal person for the job. You speak Hebrew, you speak Arabic, you've got some knowledge of the community, and you'll be leaving the day after tomorrow. So the day after tomorrow, so to speak, I found myself on a plane going to Khartoum, and I spent the night in Khartoum. Next day, I got on a bus that took me east to a place called Gedaref, which is on the border with Ethiopia. And I wandered around these camps. I saw these pitiful people who'd walked for 3 months in some cases, and they were dying at a terrible rate. And I saw the very primitive cemetery in which many of them had been buried. And one of the reasons that they died in such vast numbers was that the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, terribly badly managed the camp. They had absolutely no sense or no understanding at all of the fact that these people would not eat certain foods. And it was very often only foods that they considered to be not kosher, let's use the term. That was the only food very often that was available, and they refused to eat it. And they would sit around drinking coffee and refusing to eat. And of course, it didn't take long before they died. So this was shocking. And so I stayed there for some while. And one day I was walking down the main street of the camp, and I heard people speaking Hebrew, and there were trucks, and these Ethiopian Jews were being piled onto the trucks. And I thought, what on earth is happening? This is an Arab League state. The Sudan doesn't even have diplomatic relations with Israel. Indeed, it's still in a state of war with Israel, technically. And who's speaking Hebrew? Why are they here? And it didn't take me long to realize that this was not a place for me to be. So I thought, something's happening and I probably shouldn't be here. So I got on a bus, went back to Khartoum, went to the Grand Hotel, went to the bar, ordered a Coke. That was all that was available, and got into conversation with a guy that was sitting there. And it turned out that he'd been at Oxford. He'd studied Oriental languages. And so we had a chat. And I said, yeah, I've been doing this work on the Ethiopian Jews, and it looks like there's some sort of operation. And the guy's face went pale. And he said, whatever you've seen, you've got to forget it now. And it turned out that he was the Mossad guy that was very largely responsible for that bit of the operation. And so we had a kind of deal. I said, listen, I've got to go back. I've got to finish the job I've been given to do, but I promise that I will not reveal what I've seen to anybody. And he said, okay, well, as soon as it's possible to let you have the background of this whole thing, I personally will make sure that you get that background. So I went back to Gedaref. I saw the events unfold, which came to be known as Operation Moses. And eventually I went back to England. And a few weeks later, somebody in the West Bank, there was a settler journal called Nakuda, and they wrote an article about the operation. And it got into the mainstream press almost immediately. The story was leaked. There were still people on the ground in the Sudan. It was a terrible, terrible misdeed, I would say. And a few days later, it was the front page story of the Times, New York Times. Every newspaper in the world carried this as a headline. And so a few days later, my Mossad friend telephoned me and said, I'm coming over to London. He came over to London and he said, you did as you said you would do, and I will do as I said I would do, and I'll tell you what happened. And so he gave me the information I needed, and I went on to write Operation Moses, which was the first book. There were a few books that were written on this very exciting operation, but mine was the first to come out. And that was the beginning of my interest in Black Jews, exotic Jews, marginal Jews, and indeed, I suppose, the Lost Tribes of Israel.
Yeah, that first book is titled Operation Moses, the story of the exodus of the Falasha Jews from Ethiopia, as you say now, known as the Beta Israel. And that, I don't think it's available, by the way, but I tried to find it, but I'll just mention that. And then you wrote a number of other ones. You ended up writing a complete book, The Lost Tribes of Israel, as well as many more, which we'll discuss. And then we'll talk about the Lemba, and that's the book I mentioned, The Journey to the Vanished City. Let's talk about Debate Israel a little bit here, though, in the beginning. As you know, listeners familiar with this series are, we don't have to, I think, go over a whole overview of the kind of lost tribes in Jewish consciousness here, of, you know, different people associated with them, looking for them. That's been what the previous episodes in the series are. This is more, I don't think I said this in the beginning, this is more about modern tribes or modern, I guess, people looking for them and things like that. So that's what we'll do a little bit here. So, you know, first of all, just about the operation, if you want to just say a little bit. Obviously, it's a whole book and there's a whole history. We're not going to go super in-depth on it. If you want to mention just what you ended up learning and what happened there. But then also about the Beit Israel, about their origins, their customs, their history, and talk a little bit about them.
Yeah, well, as time went on, I did become reasonably knowledgeable about the community. That book was, I suppose, mainly about the operation, but it also talked about what I assumed the origins of the community to be. And my assumptions about the origins of the community were quite naive, I would say. And it was only later that I had a fuller sense of the way in which the community had evolved. Essentially, their history is one of a Christian group in Ethiopia around 500 years ago, morphing into a kind of Judaism. And, there were many theories about them being a lost tribe, and the kind of rabbinic idea, as you probably know, which goes back to the Radbaz in 16th century Egypt, was that, they were the lost tribe of Dan. That was his considered opinion. And, the sense among Jews at the time, in the early modern period and the sort of medieval period, was categorically that in Africa there were to be found Black Jewish communities, lost tribes. And this originated with a very interesting individual called Eldad the Danite, who wrote an amazingly, or at least he didn't exactly write it, but he left stories which were subsequently compiled into a book, which was called the Book of Eldad the Danite. And in the book, he made a very precise description of Jewish communities living in darkest Africa, possibly Ethiopia. It's not clear really where they were. But I remember that, among other things, they had a Talmud that was written in the purest Hebrew, for instance. It was a sort of magical community in some way. They lived by rules that didn't really apply to the rest of mankind. One of the things was that no child ever died in the lifetime of its parents. So, there were a few things about this community which were striking. And so Eldad wrote all this up, and it became part of the kind of mythology of Jews, that somewhere behind Islam, of course, by this time controlled the whole of North Africa and the Middle East, but beyond Islam, there was a mighty Jewish kingdom in Black Africa, which one day would come to the assistance of Christendom's beleaguered Jews. So it was often argued that, the place that Eldad the Danite was talking about must have been Ethiopia, and the community that he must have had in mind would have been the Bet Israel. And so that was one idea. Another idea was that, the literal lost tribes who disappeared from the face of the earth in the 7th century before the Common Era, that they somehow found their way to Ethiopia. Well, some very good scholarship started to manifest itself by the late 80s and early 90s on the subject of the Ethiopian Jewish community. And now it's quite categorically the case that we know more or less how they evolved. And funnily enough, the way in which they evolved into Jewish communities, which are recognized now in Israel as being Jewish communities, the same thing is happening in different parts of Africa. So last November, I was in the Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, in West Africa, and there was a meeting of representatives of about a dozen Jewish communities from different Black African countries, from Uganda to the Congo to Gabon, Zimbabwe, Côte d'Ivoire, Cameroon, all over the place. And all of these communities, in fact, had emerged from Christian communities. And that's what's now happening throughout the world, that you've got, for one reason or another, we're talking probably somewhere between 100 and 200 million people worldwide who are claiming to be Jews. Very often, this is on the basis that their ancestors were the literal lost tribes of Israel. So in Africa, it's very often the explanation for the various features of the community which they argue link them with the Jewish people.
Yeah, and this is something that you talk about a lot, and we'll get to shortly, in Black Jews in Africa and the Americas. I think you talk about how they become linked with the Jews, also how that happens to Black Jews in Africa and in the Americas, and where that comes from. But as you mentioned there, you mentioned Eldad Hadani. They have an earlier episode in this series with Dr. Michael Perry, who wrote a book on him and about him. And also you mentioned the Christian Kingdom, which Prester John have an episode in the series about him as well, the mythical Christian Kingdom, which becomes associated with Ethiopia, which is a Christian country in Africa, which is unique at the time. So you mentioned the Beit Israel, and you mentioned also the Radvaz and his psak, and then that's what Chamavad Yosef relies on, and that's all based on Eldad Hadani. So then we end up with Beit Israel now, as you mentioned. So there's more to talk about them, some of their origins, their customs, different parts of the community. We can talk about that here, or we can do more overall. I think once you mention it, it's good. We can jump. I was going to talk about the Lemba, but let's jump overall before we can get back to them. Your book, Journey to the Vanished City, is quite fascinating. It's a really fun read, I will say. But let's talk about something that you focus on, as I mentioned, in the book, Black Jews in Africa and the Americas, and how this happens. As you say, it's an outgrowth of Christian peoples, and they associate themselves with the Jews. How does that happen? How do Jews let's start with Africa. How do people in Africa decide that, hey, we're Jewish? Where does this come from in your research, in your estimation?
Well, I've written quite a lot on this because it's such an important feature of, I think, of Jewish studies currently. And there are many different reasons. One of the reasons, and I elaborated on this in my book, The Lost Tribes of Israel, The History of a Myth, which was published in 2003. And my general argument in that book was that in colonial structures, let's say in Africa, but anywhere in the world, anywhere that colonists went, and particularly Protestant colonies, there was a tendency, I think probably there was an inevitable tendency to construct Jews as a way of explaining the customs of unknown peoples. And so let's say you're a district commissioner or something like that, and you're in the African jungle, you're there to control a few tens of thousands of square miles. And, you come upon people doing weird things, and you've got to understand it. Or if you're a missionary, same thing. And so let's say they have new moon festivals, or let's say they perform circumcision, or let's say they bury in a particular way. Very often the colonists, the British colonists, or, I guess the German colonists, because the Germans were in Africa as well, very often the missionaries weren't particularly well educated. They may have been bright, they may have been brave, courageous people, but they weren't necessarily very well educated. And probably the only book that they really, really knew very, very, very well was the Bible. And so they would find in the Bible, it was a kind of a map to everything, as it was for Jews for a couple of thousand years, right, before the Enlightenment. And so they would link the parallels. So if somebody's got a new moon festival going on in, let's say, Uganda, then this would suggest to them that, well, this must have come from somewhere. Where could it have come from? It must have come from the land of Israel. So an awful lot of the early kind of Judaizing Jewish groups, let me use the term Judaizing, because in Jewish terms, and at the time, in everybody's terms, you couldn't really call them Jewish, even though they were led to believe that they were Jewish, very often by the suggestions of the missionaries and the colonists. I mean, I can give you a good example of this. It sounds far-fetched, I know, but it is the case. So I've done quite a lot of work in Papua New Guinea. And so one particular tribe, the Gogodala, who live on the Fly River estuary towards the western part of the divided island. So you've got Papua New Guinea on the eastern side, and on the western side, you've got Indonesia. And very close to the border with Indonesia, there's a tribe that lives in this estuary, and they live in stilted huts, and they fish, and they hunt, and they're pretty much hunter-gatherers, slightly more advanced. There's a certain degree of cultivation. They were cannibals until the Second World War. And I myself have been offered by them a human thumb to suck on that was stuck in the rafters of one of their huts, and it was said to be very good for a bad cold, which I had at the time. And their story essentially was that the Australian missionaries turned up. They had a very elaborate religious system. And that very, very elaborate religious system looked to the missionaries like it was very Jewish. And not only did they have this Jewish-looking religion with all kinds of rules about what you eat and what you don't eat, and new moon and all sorts of other things, but also they had Jewish noses in the middle of Papua New Guinea. So, of course, it goes without saying that there's no such thing as a Jewish nose. It's a kind of anti-Semitic myth. But as far as the missionaries were concerned, the nose of the Gogodala was a purely Jewish nose. And so one thing and another led them to believe that here we really did have a lost tribe of Israel, and this was internalized by the Gogodala, as it has been by many other communities in Papua New Guinea. If you go to the capital of Papua New Guinea in the at the time of Yom Ha'atzmaut, you'll see more Israeli flags than you find in Tel Aviv. It is the most incredible manifestation of love for the land of Israel, for the state of Israel. And there are very, very many different tribes in Papua New Guinea who fervently believe that they are literally the lost tribe of Israel. Where did the idea came from? It came initially from missionaries who found parallels between the way they did things and the way that Israelites did according to the Bible. This you can find in different ways in New Zealand, in Australia, in different parts of India and throughout Africa. North America is probably the best example as well. When the Spanish colonists came to South America, the absolutely classical way for a couple of hundred years of explicating the origins of the peoples of South America was to argue that they were literally the lost tribes of Israel. When Columbus came to America, what was he looking for? He was looking, among other things, for the lost tribes of Israel, which he thought, because lots of other people thought at the time, that they would be somewhere towards where Japan is. And of course, he didn't know that America existed, but he thought if they went round, they would get to somewhere like Japan. And in order to facilitate his conversations with the lost tribes of Israel, Columbus took with him a particular character, a converted Jew who happened to know Hebrew and Aramaic and Arabic. And with his translation, with his knowledge of these languages, he was going to be the interpreter for the expedition. So it's a worldwide phenomenon. The same thing is true in North America with the native peoples of North America, that their origins were usually, if not usually, very, very frequently understood as being lost tribes of Israel.
Yeah, the so-called Hebraic Indian theory, and I talked about that in another episode, as well as Menashe ben Israel has his book Hope of Israel, where he talks about this as well. And there's countless Christian books about this. The millenarians believe this. This has to do with they're understanding the Bible and Messiah, and this is all mixed up. So essentially, let me ask you this way: a lot of what you're saying is a lot of these communities and these people in America and in Africa and New Zealand and Australia, etc., they believe that they're Jews because of colonialism, essentially, and missionary work, but there's no real proof that they are part of the 10 lost tribes or that they were Jewish.
Well, that's a very naive thing to say, if you don't mind me saying so. Of course, there's not. I mean, there is no connection between the lost tribes of Israel died out in the 7th century before the Christian era. There's no doubt about that. They may have lived on for a couple of generations, and according to cuneiform records of the Assyrian army, we see Jewish names like, Moshe ben Yehuda or something like that in the cuneiform military lists. And so you see these for a few generations, and then after that you don't see any more because they're assimilated. They stopped using Jewish names, Hebrew names, and they became completely absorbed into the Assyrian Empire. And the idea of literal lost tribes, hanging on in Afghanistan or someplace or Tibet, it's pure myth. Now, myth is very often a good deal more interesting than history. It can be more meaningful than history and more influential than something that historically happened. And that's the reason for my interest in it. It seems to me that the lost tribes of Israel, which today as we speak is affecting the lives and the beliefs of hundreds of millions of people throughout the world, can be seen to be one of the most enduring and one of the most powerful myths that human civilizations ever produced.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't saying otherwise. In fact, I've said in this series, as I pointed out...
You were asking a quite naive question. You were saying that they were led to believe that there were lost tribes. But is there any proof that they are? No, I wasn't saying that they were. Obviously, they're not.
I was 100%. I just was trying to emphasize that. And I think, listen, I've mentioned this other parts in this series. The Gemara and Sanhedrin, Rabbi Akiva says that the Gemara says, according to Rabbi Akiva, some learn differently, but that's what he says. There's in the basic Pshat, Rabbi Eliezer says otherwise, but even there, the Gemara comes up in other places in the Chazal that there's no Aser Shvatim, like you're saying, they're gone. Another thing that you talk about as well, besides for these, is also the Black Jews of America. So not the Native Americans, the Black Jews in America, again, not from, originally from Africa, but I guess the ones when the communities in America, they start believing that they are also Jewish. And you talk about this in again, your book, Black Jews in Africa and the Americas. How does that start? Is that from the same thing, or that meaning, well, here it wouldn't be necessarily missionaries and colonialism, would be like when they were enslaved, but is that when this starts, or does it start after that? When does that begin?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was very, very interesting, in a way, a very natural development. And you could see it as being a similar thing because both in the case of lots and lots of different African communities, let's say in Kenya or Uganda or South Africa, the idea that they were Jewish came about as a result of a certain kind of interpretation of the Bible. Now, in the case of the blacks who were working as slaves in North America, they were introduced to Christianity pretty early on. And whatever religions they had when they came were very speedily lost, not least because groups were broken up. There was never kind of any sort of community spirit that lasted for more than a few months or years. And so they became Christianized in a certain kind of way, and they read different bits of the Bible. And the idea that they were in some sense Israelites was, it was a question of practical analogy. Here you have the Israelites slaving in Pharaoh's land, and then you've got all the so-called Negro spirituals, which are, singing this kind of song. And it just seems to be the same experience that they're going through. And so it probably started with this kind of analogy. And then towards the end of the 19th century, it became very much more focused. And it became focused in a way, I don't know whether you've come across the British Israelite movement. Well, this is something that started probably in about the 18th century. By the end of the 19th century, it was a powerful international movement with millions of members in the United States of America, Canada, Australia, Great Britain. And it literally thought that the British peoples, or the Anglo-Saxon peoples, but specifically the British peoples, were specifically a lost tribe. And this entered the Pentecostal faith. And from the Pentecostals, this got to African Americans. And they picked the whole thing up. And, various theologians and preachers in the 1880s started elaborating upon this. And by the time you get to the Harlem revival in the 20s, it's really quite big business, and it still is today. So there are lots of African American, communities all over America. And so, if I were to answer the question, which I suspect you might ask, which is there any literal truth to this? I would have to say literal truth and religion don't really go together very well. And I certainly don't want to disparage anybody's religious sentiments.
Now, there's another, another concept that you discuss in the book as well, in one of your books, where you talk about how, especially in Europe in the early modern period and on, before that, there's kind of this racist, anti-Semitic, together ideology, kind of conflating blacks and Jews together, and kind of, you point out a lot of these kind of anti-Semitic and racist tropes and quotes and lines and things like that. And how does that play into all of this?
Well, that's a very good question. And my last book is called Hybrid Hate. And this is, conflations of anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism from the Renaissance up to the period of the Third Reich. And so what I argue in that book is that, the figure of the Jew and the figure of the Black in European Christian thinking were often absolutely interchangeable. And even if you go back to medieval times, and if you look, for instance, at illustrations in manuscripts showing Jews, very often they're colored black, or they have some other feature of the figures which suggests that they've got something in common with Africans. There's an interesting conversation from the early 16th century, which is written, funnily enough, in Latin and in Hebrew, and I think in German. It happens in Germany and is written by a Christian Hebraist. And so the conversation is between a Jew and a Christian. And the Christian comes up to the Jew and says, "Hello, Jew, how are you doing?" And the Jew says, "How do you know I'm a Jew?" "Ah, well, I know how you're a Jew, because you're black. You're black and you're ugly." And so, from this, and I found hundreds of examples of this kind of collation of blackness and Jews. color of Jews, as far as medieval Christians were concerned, was black in just about every case. And this idea continues. It sort of softens during the period of the Enlightenment, hardens during the 19th century with the rise of scientific racism, so-called, and becomes again a big feature of Nazi anti-Semitic practice and belief. And so there's a very interesting thing that happens right at the beginning of the Third Reich, when they're trying to elaborate a legal system that will effectively discriminate against Jews. But the only problem was that it was very difficult for them to define what a Jew was. They didn't really have any metrics to create a definition that would be good for all legal purposes. And the German lawyers were sticklers for order and for logic, and there was no definition that worked for them. And so they played around with trying to use the American system that had been introduced to discriminate against blacks, but not directly. So, during Jim Crow, they couldn't say exactly, blacks aren't allowed to do it. At least the federal legal structure couldn't discriminate against blacks because it goes against the Constitution. But they find a way around this, and it's know it when you see it. And so they apply this know it when you see it system in Nazi Germany. And so somebody says, well, but in America they say they've got a way of saying, well, it's one drop, and then that, and then you can prove that you can prove that they're black, or you can see that they're black. And the answer came: no German would have the slightest doubt who you're referring to if you talk about colored people in Germany. So colored people by itself would indicate to everybody they were actually talking about Jews. Now, that's a rather complicated and convoluted argument, but it is nonetheless based on the records of the time. It's what Germans thought. Germans thought that Jews were partly Negroid and certainly black or dark. The cartoons in Der Stürmer and everywhere else portray Jews as being dark of skin, swarthy at the very least. And the very interesting thing that I came across, and it was the thing that really started me on the book, was coming across an 18th century book written by a German missionary who'd been sent to one of the Caribbean islands to write a report on the slaves held by the Danish church in that island of St. Thomas. And so his way of doing the book was to interview all of these slaves. And he was a meticulous scholar, an amazingly good scholar. And one of the slaves that he interviewed was from a West African kingdom called Loango. And so the slave, among other things, told him that in Loango, there was an interesting community of black Jews who lived on the coast in a separate village, and they had their own cemetery, which was constructed very beautifully in stone. And there were images of snakes and lizards, according to him, on the gravestones, and they didn't speak on the Sabbath, and they didn't communicate, they didn't eat with the Negroes who lived there, and so on and so forth. It's quite a chunky passage. And I thought, my goodness, a couple of years before, I'd written this book for Harvard University Press, the the black Jews of Africa. I never mentioned this black Jewish community in Loango, so I was kind of rather put out. And so I started finding out everything I possibly could about this Jewish community in Loango. What did I discover? It was an amazing moment. And I discovered that this community, this black Jewish community in Loango, was very, very well known to the philosophers of the 18th century Enlightenment in France and Germany, all over the place. And they were constantly being used as a way of proving that the Jewish people, who of course don't mix with other people, are going to change color depending where they are in the world. And so if you put a Jew down in Central Africa, he'll become black, and the Jews of Loango were a proof of this. And then the Jews of Kochi, some of whom were black, similarly were used for this thing. And, you know, this fed into the idea that the Jews could be black. And when they were black, they were absolutely black. And, you know, and then that, of course, feeds into the idea of these were the good guys, actually. The people who thought that you could change color were good guys, because the bad guys, in race terms, were the guys that said, no, no race can ever change. Race is immutable. It's the most important thing in the world. You can't change anything about it. It determines everything that you do, everything that you think, everything that you create. All is to do with race, and that essentially was the Nazi idea. That's the reason that the Jews had to be destroyed from the logic of their race theory.
Yeah, that's something that you discuss. I think you quote also a medieval person, the beginning of black Jews in Africa. You quote, I think, Bruno, right, who says such an idea: Jews can't be blacks, blacks can't be Jews. This kind of racist, anti-Semitic tropes. Now let's go back. I was going to leave that all for later. Once we talked about debate Israel, I wanted to talk about the Lemba, who you have a fascinating book, Journey to the Vanished City. But once we got into that whole discussion, we went there. Let's talk about it here. We'll go. We can go back and forth a little. Where you talk about the Lemba, and so I'm going to assume that I didn't know much about them before I read your book. So I'll assume here, and maybe I shouldn't, that a lot of listeners maybe aren't familiar with them. So tell the listeners a little bit about them, where they live, and their customs, how they differ from local tribes, Avenda and other local tribes, and how you got involved with. Essentially, you were there on the ground searching for them.
Okay, so the story is this, that, I get back from Khartoum and, the Operation Moses, and some few months later I was invited to go to South Africa to give a lecture about the Ethiopian Jews at the University of the Witwatersrand University. And so there were a lot of, Jewish people came to my lecture, and they were, fairly prosperous and nicely dressed and all that. And at the back of the big hall, there were probably a dozen very poor-looking black people wearing yarmulkes and not wearing shoes in some cases. And they looked pretty bedraggled. And after the lecture, I wandered over to them, and they kind of shook my hands fervently and said, "Hey, we're the same as these Falasha people, and we also came from the north, like the Ethiopian Jews, and we've got the same customs." And indeed, one of them had been with his boss for some reason or another, so he told me. This was back in about 1987. He'd been to Ethiopia and he'd seen them, and he knew where they lived, and he knew that their customs were very similar to those of this tribe. So I said, "Okay, well, this doesn't, maybe, possibly," but I didn't look as if I believed anything about their Jewish origins. And they said, no, you've got to believe what we're saying. So all you need to do is to come with us to our villages, and we'll show you. So that weekend, they drove me right up to the border with Zimbabwe, Venda, and I spent a couple of days in one of the villages and little huts, and they told me about their circumcision, about their animal slaughter, about their form of kashrut, let's call it that, and then their names. Some of them looked rather Hebraic, and most of all, they told me about their story. And their story had it that they'd come from a place called Senna in the north, and then they'd come to Africa. They'd crossed something called Pusela. They left Senna, they crossed Pusela, they came to Africa, they rebuilt Senna somewhere, and then they disobeyed the law of God and ate mice, which was against the rules. And after that, they were scattered among the nations of Africa. That was basically the story of what's called ethnogenesis. So it's an amazing story. And one of their chiefs, he implored me, he said, we need to find Senna. If we're to be a people like the other peoples of the world, we need to find where we came from. And he said, if you go north from here, if you go to the villages in Zimbabwe, if you go to Malawi and find Lemba people there, if you go to Tanzania, you'll find more Lemba people up there. And they will guide you. You go to one village, they will guide you to the next, and you'll be able to follow the path that will lead you to Jerusalem. Well, it's a great idea for a book. And so I went back to England and I spoke to Lord Weidenfeld, who was a great Jewish publisher, one of the greatest in the United Kingdom. I told him the story, and he said, you've got to write it. And he gave me enough money to be able to take off from my university. I was then a professor at the University of London. And so I go back to Africa and I do this. I follow the trail as I can find it, stay in the villages, live in the villages. And so I was on the road for about 6 months. And eventually I get to the Indian Ocean. And all of my little clues that I'd been collecting on the way dried up, and there was just sea. And I had absolutely no idea at this point if they were originally Jewish or indeed where they'd come from. I knew that they'd come to the east coast of Africa, but I didn't really know from where. I had no idea where this fabulous Senna was. And it was only a couple of years later when I wrote the book, finishing it up there with a big question mark, but detailing their kind of, their anthropology, if you like. And indeed, lots of the things that they did, their 12-tribe structure, their kind of kashrut, their circumcision, their the massive importance they attributed to the slaughter of animals and not eating animals that hadn't been slaughtered in a particular kind of way, and so on and so forth. It all looked either like Islam or like Judaism, so you could say it looked like some sort of Semitic religion. And anyway, a couple of years later, I'm in the Yemen. I wrote a book on the Jews of the Yemen, which is called the Road to Redemption. Redemption being the camp that was built outside Aden, through which practically all the Yemenite Jews went on their way to Israel between 1948 and 1951. And there were still Jews there when I was in the Yemen in the 90s, and they were living up, most of them, in a place called Sada, which has sadly been destroyed by the Saudis with American and British arms, and it exists no more. And the Jews indeed have left. And while I was there, I traveled down the Hadramaut, which is mentioned in the Bible, as you know. And while I was there in the very religious Muslim town of Tarim, I met a Mukhtar who was very knowledgeable and learned, and he invited me for lunch, and we're chatting. And he said, "What are you working on? You're a scholar. What are you working on?" I said, "Well, I'm working on this. I'm working on the Jews who live in the Yemen, but I'm also interested in this Black Jewish or supposedly Jewish group in Africa, and they say they came from a place called Senna, and then they left and they went to Africa." And he said, "Whoa, that's interesting." And because at the end of the Hadramaut, if you go right to the end of the Hadramaut, there's a place called Senna, and there's an old story here that at a certain time the dam at the end of the wadi cracked. Agriculture was no longer possible, and the people that lived there went down to the sea, and then they got on a boat and they went to Africa. Well, it did sound very much like the Lemba story, but obviously, there was no smoking gun. You couldn't prove anything from that. But this was just about the time when genetics was becoming usable for, if you like, historical purposes. And so I had the bright idea of doing a DNA collect in Africa of Lemba and surrounding tribes, and then comparing it with the groups, with the Bedouin and other people who lived still around the destroyed town of Senna in the Eastern Hadramaut. And I should also mention that the people who lived around Senna in the Eastern Hadramaut, they all had similar names to the Lemba tribes. So, it looked like I was making progress here. And so we did a massive collect in the Yemen. We did a massive collect in Zimbabwe and Mozambique and other African countries. And the results were that on the male line, that the Lemba came from the Middle East. And I don't know whether you've come across the famous haplotype, which is called the Cohen modal haplotype. Well, the Cohen modal haplotype is a particular genetic signature which is common to Cohenim, and that thing. I was one of the writers of one of the papers that revealed this to be the case. And so hundreds of Kohanim throughout the world were tested, with a swab in the mouth. And it turned out that around 52% of all Kohanim had a rare haplotype, relatively rare haplotype, which is also found among non-Kohanim, but at a very much lower degree, as you would expect, in fact. And when we looked at the Lemba results, we discovered that one of the tribes, a tribe that they referred to as the priestly tribe, also had this Cohen modal haplotype at a very high degree of 52% of the people tested. So this, of course, was massive. I was on 60 Minutes talking about this. It was, once again, it was front page on the New York Times and everywhere in the world, pretty much. And it was a really, really big story and a very interesting one. And that really entered the 1,000-year-old debate of who is a Jew in a very interesting way. So, as time went on, it became pretty much possible to say who is of Jewish origin by looking at the DNA of the individuals concerned, and this seemed to put the Lemba in Klal Israel, as you might call it, and So this was very interesting. More recent research would suggest that this was not as watertight as scientists thought at the time, 25 years ago. But for a long time, it was thought to be quite a watertight thing. But for me, it was an embarrassment because, in a way, I'd been with the Lemba, I knew their history, I'd studied it, I'd researched it. And it seemed to me that their protestation that they were Jewish did not come from a long memory of being Jewish, but it came because missionaries had been active in the areas that they lived in Venda and in Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, and they'd seen that they had these practices which looked Jewish, and that they had internalized this as a result of interaction with the missionaries and with colonists. And indeed, many of the senior figures in early South African history knew about the Lemba, President Kruger being one. And for a long time, the community were called Kruger's Jews. It was kind of a joke. But anyway, there we are. So this becomes a thing. And I know one of the questions that when we spoke earlier, you would really like to address here is there any kind of mileage to the kind of wider idea that blacks are Israelites? There are an awful lot of African Americans and other black people who believe very, very literally that they are of Israelite origin or Jewish origin, if you wish. And this news that comes out of South Africa and Zimbabwe round about 1997, 1998, that there is a Jewish gene, this is very much in inverted commas, to be found among black Jews living there, for them was manna. And so that really, really has entered the discourse about the possibility of being black and being Jewish.
In your new edition of Journey to the Vanished City, you added this chapter as like a postscript now that about the DNA. It's in the book, so you can read on it. Although, as you've said, in recent years, it's kind of been proven not to be as watertight, as you said, as it was then. So that is not in the kind of afterword, right? That new information. The afterword was just after you found out.
That was published. That was published 20 odd years ago.
Right. And I will say about the Journey to the Vanished City, which I read, it's really a lot of fun. I read already from the back where it calls you the British Indiana Jones, but another one of the blurbs was a rare mixture of scholarship and travelogue. There isn't a dull line in the book. And I really agree with that. I think it's quite fun and a fascinating read. It's almost like a novel, but it's a travelogue, and it's really a lot of fun. So it's written very engagingly, I'll tell you that. And for any listeners, you want a fun read about something you probably don't know much about. It's really interesting to learn about the Lemba, how they differ from the neighboring tribes, the Venda and others, and their customs and the people there. It's really very interesting. Also, I learned a lot about Great Zimbabwe. I don't know if you mentioned the ruins there in Great Zimbabwe, and was that Senna? There's these kind of amazing ruins there called Great Zimbabwe in Zimbabwe. So that was quite interesting to hear about that as well. And so I think we mentioned a number of your books, I think. I'll just mention some others just in case we missed any. You mentioned Black Jews in Africa and the Americas mentioned a bunch of times. Journey to the Vanished City about the Lemba, Hybrid Hate. You mentioned your newest book, Conflations of Anti-Semitism and Anti-Black Racism from the Renaissance to the Third Reich. You mentioned your book, I think I mentioned this earlier, also The Lost Tribes of Israel, The History of a Myth. I think that's maybe around, but it's a little expensive. You mentioned Operation Moses. You also have a book, I believe this is yours, right? 13th Gate, Travels Among the Lost Tribes of Israel. And then there's many books you edited and wrote, and I'm sure I'm missing some. Also, I would mention a book on a different topic that's similar, talking about Indiana Jones, is the Lost Ark of the Covenant. Maybe is that where the Indiana Jones moniker comes from? How'd you get to that? Just, I know that's a different thing. We're not talking about that, but once I'm reading about the book.
Yeah, well, that was a bit of yeah. I was forced in a way by the publisher. It was published by a big American publisher, and it was produced in very many copies. And I really wanted it to be called something to do with the Black Ark or the African Ark or something like that. If you actually read it, it's another travel kind of book, and it's got to do with the Ngoma of the Lemba. And as soon as it seemed at the time that the genetic evidence was absolutely watertight, and that you've got these Israelite priests wandering through Africa, and they were carrying this drum which had many of the appurtenances of the ark. And so, I knew about the magic drum when I wrote The Journey to the Vanished City. I knew all about it, but I didn't really mention it very much, just en passant. I didn't make a big deal of it being the ark or anything like that. And however, I finally came to the conclusion that at the very least there was an argument to be made that there were similarities, and that maybe the idea of the ark lay somehow very remotely behind the idea of the Ngoma. And then I discovered the Ngoma because it had been lost. I discovered the Ngoma, and it was radiocarbon dated, and it turned out to be the oldest wooden object ever found in sub-Saharan Africa, which is a pretty big deal. And the Lemba story basically said that, around about 500 years ago, 600 years ago, the ark, they called it the ark, blew up. And that's exactly what the ark was likely to do. If you read the Bible, it's constantly blowing up and killing people. And so we built a new one, but we used a little bit of the original one, which is right at the bottom of this ark. And so anyway, I told the story of, looking for the ark. And it's true. I did look for the ark, and I did find it in some dusty old museum in Harare in Zimbabwe. It had been previously photographed and listed, but during the Civil War, it had been taken from where it had been and basically lost to scholarship, and indeed to the Lemba people themselves. So that's what that book was about. And it got me into a lot of trouble with President Mugabe, the late and horrible president of Zimbabwe. And I was lucky not to get arrested because I said some horrible things about him, completely justified. And now, and President Mugabe almost certainly stole the ark because he was a very superstitious old man. And so rumor had it that he would put water into it and mix potions and stuff like that because he believed in the veracity of the story.
Wow, pretty amazing. So there's that book as well, and I did I didn't read it, but now I think I'll have to get it. But I read the Journey to the Vanished Cities. Any indication? Reading your travelogue is a lot of fun. So okay, so I think we covered a lot over here, and hopefully this was interesting. As I said, this is a series, an episode about the lost tribes. So these are kind of modern myths or modern tribes, associated with the lost tribes of Israel. So this was an important addition. One last thing, I realized I didn't ask you. There are some other tribes as well we didn't mention. The Igbo, I think, and some others that you've talked about in other places, right? There are other ones, but it all goes back to the broad, idea that we were talking earlier, right? All these tribes. Is that accurate?
I don't know. I mean, if it's difficult to say how it really starts. In the case of the Igbo, there are missionaries in the early 19th century, around about 1820, or even perhaps early. In fact, there's one individual towards the end of the 18th century who's talking about the Igbo being Jewish, and so the story's been around for a long time. Today, in Nigeria, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of Nigerian historians who've created elaborate structures to explain precisely how the lost tribes got to Nigeria and to the areas inhabited by the Igbo. And currently, there's a separatist movement in what used to be called Biafra. Remember the Biafra disaster, where nearly 1 million died, and very often in Africa, what happens? You have these terrible genocides. That's one, and the Tutsi genocide is another. And so again, analogy tends to play a major role. So one of the things that happened was that they knew that they had been deserted by the world. They knew they were being persecuted. They knew that a Holocaust was happening, just like it happened to the Jews, and that brought them closer to the idea of being Jewish or being Israelite. Same is true of the Tutsi, and it's an extraordinarily potent myth in Nigeria at the moment, and the Israelite nature of the Igbo absolutely underlies the kind of separatist story and project.
So just in closing, what would you say? You haven't been looking for the lost tribes, but looking at modern tribes, let's say, and their association with Judaism and Jewishness.
I still find it very interesting, and at the moment, I'm writing 2 books. One of them is looking at the worldwide conversionary movement, if you like, to Judaism. And so, in South America and Central America, and I was in Indonesia researching last year, and as I told you, in Cote d'Ivoire, and I recently been to El Salvador and Colombia and places like this, looking at these developing Jewish communities. And so, one of the books I wrote was called the 13th Gate. And so what is the 13th Gate? So this is a Hasidic story, and we could finish with that. It's nice. So, there were 13 gates set into the wall of Jerusalem. Okay. 12 of those gates were intended for the 12 tribes. And the 13th gate was for the person who'd forgotten which tribe he belonged to. And, this idea of the 13th gate, it seems to me to apply to an awful lot of the aspiring Jews throughout the world who have a kind of sense of ambiguity about their own origins and about their own past and their own history. And, they wish to enter the metaphorical city of Jerusalem, and the gate that is available to them is the 13th gate.
Okay, so I will link to all your books. I'll try. Like I mentioned, some of them are not available. So, anyone can put your name into Amazon or into Google, and some of them are available used. But whatever is available, I'll link to in the show's notes that those interested can check out. And again, you can just find other ones also. But whatever I can find, I can link to for those interested that can read. And hopefully this was informative and interesting. And in addition to the series, something that really was not covered elsewhere in the series. So thank you, Professor Parfit, for joining me.
It's been a pleasure. Enjoyed talking to you.